Behind every bit of mom wisdom is a story of a real mom and real kids just trying to love each other well. Whether you're cozied up on the couch with a mug of coffee or out for a walk, you're welcome to join us as we share stories and laugh, learn, and grow together. It's the iMom Podcast. Welcome to this week's episode of the iMom Podcast. I'm Abby, and Megan and Susan and Chloe are here again this week, and we're picking up on our conversation from last week about families going through big changes together. And if you missed last week's episode, definitely go back and listen. You'll hear the story of Susan and her husband Mark making the decision to adopt and Megan's point of view on that. And then we also talked about when you don't get a say in the changes that come, like a spouse being deployed or transferred or somebody in your family getting sick. It was a really great conversation. And so be sure to go back and check that out.
Yeah. And one of the things I was thinking about, because I think about this all the time, in the previous episode, I think I talked about this a little bit, but how we moved, I think it was like 7 times in the first couple years of our marriage, which we did feel called to do each time. But then it hits a point where you're like, do we feel called to do this? Or are we just doing it because that's the next logical next step? And so I'm constantly thinking, is this what we're being called to do? Or do we need to really take a hard look at this and pivot and really kind of figure out what our next steps look like? Or how do you change things when things aren't turning out as you expected?
I know that, having been through a divorce, I definitely didn't feel like God was calling me to divorce. And nobody ever goes into marriage thinking they're going to get a divorce. And so I definitely think that you have to change your mindset. And for me, that took leaning on God. So I don't know, maybe in your deployment, in Hampton's deployments and all the moves and stuff, there was a moment you're like, I can't rely on myself for this.
Totally.
It has to be my faith that is going to carry me through this. And then, choosing to love more than be bitter, whether that's with an ex or being bitter with God because, hey, I just got settled here and now we have to move again. Constantly choosing to love your spouse, love the person who you're divorcing, which looks a little bit different, but, choosing to love that person, to me, is how we get through those moments that we feel like we're not being given a great choice in this,
Totally. And I think when you have such big life changes, like those 2 examples, you really have nothing, like you have nowhere else to turn. You kind of feel like, okay, this is the only place left I have to go is to lean on your faith and your close family and your friends and things like that, just to get through some of those tougher situations. And some of the things I always try to do, which everyone always says this, so it kind of annoys me, is they're like, practice an attitude of gratitude. And I'm like, okay, well, I feel like my whole world around me is falling apart and I've started over. My husband just deployed, or I'm going through a divorce or whatever it might be. But I literally would sit there and like list out some things that I was happy about and try to focus on those versus constantly focusing on the negative, which I kind of tend to do. And so that was just something that I constantly, if I'm feeling down about something or frustrated or upset, is really go back to those things that I have been provided for. And I think too, when it is a calling, you can look back and really see the forest for the trees, or whatever the saying is, and really see, okay, I was supposed to do that and I was following that call, and that we were supposed to do that.
Yeah.
The science behind it, like we can't think 2 thoughts at once. So what you said, Megan, it's scientifically proven to change your mindset is if you are dwelling on grateful thoughts, you can't think thoughts of complaining. You can't think negative thoughts. So, it's cliche, but the science proves it. It changes your mindset.
Well, and the reality is to know yourself. Some people do not like change. Some people do, but none of us likes bad change, like difficult things that happen. But we have to remember, every great movie or every great story is built on somebody who went through something difficult. And in that adversity, they were stretched and grown into something incredible. And that's what God does. He uses adversity and suffering to refine us and to build our character and to teach us things we need to know. And so if you look at change in that is, okay, God is going to make all things good. He does. And the good that will usually come out of it is the change in you.
Isn't there a term for that, about this every story, like the hero's moment or the hero's something like that? Like there's an actual literary term for the moment in the story when that happens, because there's not really a story without it.
Right.
Well, I think too, a tough thing about our day and age, one thing I think we forget is that everyone does go through those seasons. There's not one person that makes it through life without having a tough season.
They just don't put it on their Instagram.
But it's not on Instagram. And I think it's really hard when you're going through tough seasons and then you feel like no one else is having a tough season. But I think we have to remember that everyone does. It's impossible to not. So, yeah.
So when you think about going through hard things, how much of it do you think is appropriate to share with your kids, whether it's, going through a divorce and how much you wanted to share with your kids from your perspective or, your husband's perspective, or even, I don't know, something else as far as like a medical diagnosis or even financial troubles? How much do you share with your kids?
I think it's funny that you ask that after Megan mentions posting stuff on Instagram. It's like we're more likely to post something and share it with, 700 people who we're friends with or follow us versus our own family members. And I think you got to take that kind of one situation at a time. I don't think there's like a blanket answer to that. But I think that if it's not something that's definite, or if it's not something that is, actual reality yet, I don't know if I would share all of the kind of the intimate thoughts in the conversations you have with your husband about things like a move. Maybe you're not going to move. I don't know if I would come out and say, hey, kids, we might be moving if you're not going to move. That would be traumatic. But do you disagree?
Totally.
Oh, okay.
So let me tell you my story and why. So I do have pretty good, Megan would probably confirm this. I have pretty good intuition, and even as a child did. And I remember when my parents were considering a move to Texas. We lived in Florida at the time, and I kept hearing things. I just had a sense something was going down, and I was a junior in high school, and I was just like convinced. And then I was on, that super high radar, like trying to catch whatever. And so my parents didn't discuss things with us, and there were other cases. And so it just made me more on alert, hyper vigilant. And so I tried, like, they didn't tell me about the birds and the bees, and I had to learn in the neighborhood, it was just constantly, I was like trying to figure stuff out. So I decided when we got parents that I was always going to be super transparent and let discussions happen. I can't say Mark and I discussed every little nitty-gritty
Well, but it's funny you say that, because I remember you guys sitting us down and telling us we might be moving to Tallahassee. I don't remember what grade I was in. And I was like, no, I don't want to go. Like, I had a full-blown meltdown because I didn't want to leave my friends. And then we did move. And I was like, wait a minute. What?
Megan, now, because you went through the more transparent.
We're going back and forth.
I know. It's literally just going to go back and forth from generation to generation. Yeah, exactly. No, it's literally.
I think your kids, the situation, and you're not going to get it right every time. But I do think that there are some times that you should share, because it might give you and your kids a chance to pray about something together. Daddy is probably quitting his job. He's going to leave. So why don't we pray about a new position for him? Like involve them in the actual like life of your family, and then like, oh, well, dad interviewed for a job and he didn't get it. And then you can share that disappointment. Right. It's like letting your kids into life.
Yeah. I feel too, depending on your child, fanciful children with great imaginations, if they sense a story is going down and they don't know the facts of the story, they will make their own story. And that was my case. I would fill in the blank with things that oftentimes were much worse, just because I was hearing these tidbits about things. My mother talking to a friend or something. You think your kids aren't listening. They are listening, and they can start fabricating things that are really much worse than what's going on.
Yeah. I think that also it lets our kids see this like resilience in us sometimes when we share the challenges that we're facing. They can see resilience. They see our faith actually being put into action versus just, what we say in our prayers or what they see us profess on a Sunday. They actually can see our faith working when we share the difficult stuff with them.
Yeah, they can see when you're sad. They can see when you're disagreeing with your husband. They can see resolution. It's a good thing.
My dad took a second job when I can't even remember. I was probably like late elementary, early high school. And he took a second job working like the background of concession at Lightning games. So he was like moving sodas from one place to the other and, stuff like that. And I was just like, oh my gosh, my dad drives all that way. And maybe was even like where they used to play in St. Pete. So he would drive from Brandon to St. Pete, which, if you're out of town, that's a good, hour and 10-minute drive. And just to make ends meet for us. And I'm sure that they maybe thought, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't tell the girls that. Maybe we should keep it quiet so they don't have to worry. But they did. And I saw how hard my dad worked. And then he told me about a time he literally ran into Wayne Gretzky, like physically bumped into him. And he was like, he's really big. I'm like, oh, well, that's awesome.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a different perspective on that. So my parents working in ministry, I'm a pastor's kid. And I think one thing my parents did a really good job of not giving my brothers and me too much information as to what was going on behind the scenes at the church. Just because, church people are still people and they hurt people and they make the wrong decisions. Pastors make the wrong decisions. All sorts of things happen. And I didn't know a lot of the stuff that happened at our church until I was a grown up, And I remember having a conversation with my dad a couple of years ago, like, hey, what happened to that pastor? And he told me the whole story. And I was like, wow, how did you go through all that and not really share it with us? He's like, I did not want you guys to experience church hurt at that age. And I think they did a really good job kind of, having discernment on what information was age appropriate, because it's not like he was lying or keeping secrets from us, but it wasn't appropriate. And I'm thankful he didn't share with us because I didn't need to know those full details.
Yeah, I do think the nature of the problem, the thing that's going on, is also probably a good indicator of whether or not you share it with your kids.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I remember, so I have two kind of examples of this. One was when, Susan, you had to get a new pacemaker every 4 years. And this is before they could do it kind of laparoscopically, like
Not 4.
How many years?
Like 7 or 8.
Oh, it felt like 4 to me. I don't know. But anywho, they would literally, I was little and they would literally cut you from your collarbone all the way almost down to your waist on both sides. Oh. And so you'd come home from the hospital and there would be like Frankenstein staples all
to
the
her,
way.
It looked that big. They're not, like 4 inches.
Oh my, it looked in my mind, it is completely down your torso. But
oh gosh.
You guys had to tell us a good bit about that because we had to know we couldn't jump on you and that you were going to be in bed for a long time and that friends were going to be taking us to school and a number of things, and that you were going to the hospital and that you were for sure going to come back. Cause we had this in our mind that something really bad was happening.
Oh my gosh. They would stand in the front on the sofa in the front window, just waving at me when I left. It was the most pitiful thing. My heart would that was the hardest part of the whole surgery.
Yeah. Well, it was terrible. Cause I would remember I'd do the math on the years and be like, okay, it's coming down less than a year. She's going to have to do it again. But you told us what was happening so that we weren't, like you said, filling the blanks with worst case scenario. And we knew what we could and couldn't do and what was going to happen and everything like that. And then the other example I was thinking in my head was when you guys were adopting, and through every step of that, I remember being asked multiple times, how do you guys feel about this? What would you think about this? Could you envision them being part of our family? This is what's going to change. This is, how your life is going to change, everything like that. And so there wasn't a time where I didn't feel like we were very much part of that process and that we didn't have a say in that process, which I think was important because in our minds, we were part of the decision making. And so we were in it. We had bought into the idea of it going forward.
What would you have said, Susan, if one of the kids had really felt strongly about not adopting?
We would have had to work through that, but we knew we were called to adopt. So that would have been, on the prayer list, change their heart so that they're in it. They were so part of the process. They felt like they were.
But I think a good thing too is you guys painted a picture for us of what their life would look like if they had to go back to Siberia and how their life would probably turn out and what the statistics were. You guys said they will probably die. They will be forced into a life of horrible pain going forward if we do not. So we were very aware of how differently their life would look if they joined our family versus if they went back and were not adopted.
And I think they had been exposed enough to underprivileged kids to understand that life. So
we've been on a number of mission trips.
Yeah. So I think their hearts were ready. God prepared them and they were ready. Now, after we did it, there were more struggles. They changed their minds quite a few times.
Yeah. But I love what you said there, Susan, of in Megan, your story, because as parents, we should not be afraid to ask our kids, what do you think of this? Knowing that if the answer is something that challenges the direction we're planning on going, we can pray and ask God and he'll give us wisdom on how to handle those next steps.
Yep.
But I think too, you could have said, oh, okay, you don't feel good about it, we won't do it, or not give us the details of what their life could potentially look like. You guys open our eyes to some pretty harsh realities of what their lives could look like in order for us to really understand.
Yeah, this is going to make some parents mad. But, I do think today in the current culture that we treat our children like adults and expect them to make adult decisions. And, the reason God gives children parents is because their bodies and minds and their maturity is not at a level where they can make decisions for themselves. And we have to remember that they are children. They're half-baked. And so, when parents are called to things or have to make tough decisions, that's part of our calling, is to make them for our children. And while you want them to be part of the process, in the end, you're the adult. And I say that because I do feel like we are asking a lot of our children to make decisions today, not just in our callings, but in things that affect their health and stuff that they're really not supposed to be making for themselves, or God would have let them be born unto themselves like little alligators. They would have been hatched and gone on their way without parents. That's not how He created us.
When it comes to big changes coming to your family, I think the point is, don't run from the hard things and don't hide them from your kids if they are appropriate to share, because our kids don't need perfect lives. They need parents who are willing to struggle and to persevere. And that is a great teacher. And it's a great way to bring everybody in your family closer together. If you want to read more about Susan and Megan's family's adoption story, I'll link to it in the show notes. It's a great one and definitely something to think about if you are considering adopting or fostering as well. And thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the iMom podcast. iMom is the motherhood program of the nonprofit organization Family First. Along with our fatherhood program, All Pro Dad, we exist to help you love your family well. Subscribe to our daily email, the iMom Minute, by going to imom.com/subscribe and get tons of great ideas, insight, and inspiration. The iMom podcast is hosted by me, Abby Watts, along with Susan Merrill, Megan Tigner, and Chloe Blumenthal.